Hello everybody! Today I'm going to show you the difference between application permissions and delegated permissions in Microsoft Entra ID. This difference is not very well known, and even administrators usually mix these things up. They don't usually know the exact difference between delegated permissions and application permissions. They are not sure what we are talking about when I mention delegated permissions and application permissions. So I hope I will be able to bring more clarity into this and explain you the differences between application permissions and delegated permissions so that you know what's the difference and in what situation you should use application permissions or delegated permissions. All right. Let's get to it. Let's start with enterprise applications here. These enterprise applications provide you delegated access, delegated permissions. Delegated permissions in Microsoft Entra ID means that the application itself doesn't have any permissions, but it acts on behalf of a user. So the application acts on behalf of a assigned user, and the application has permissions of the user. So simply put, the user gives the application some permissions to do something for the user. Very simple example would be, for example, email and email clients. Outlook itself, the application Outlook on your computer or your phone itself doesn't have any permissions in the tenant. User needs to sign in to the application, and the application then acts as some kind of a gateway between the user account and the email service on the background. That's delegated access, because the user, by signing in to the application, delegates access to the application to send emails, read emails, work with calendar, and so on. So that's a simple example of delegated access. Delegated access that simply means that the application itself doesn't have any permissions but acts on behalf of a signed-in user. And it's very important that the user needs to be signed in. So whenever the access expires, the application loses access to the data, to the identity. So the authentication needs to be valid and active in order for the application to maintain access to the backend service. The default applications that you use are probably already registered in the tenant, pre-registered in the tenant. All of the Microsoft first-party applications are pre-registered in the tenant. But in general, anything that you want to use or anything that your users use needs to be registered for delegated access in Microsoft Entra ID, including the Microsoft first-party applications. Like I've said, the Microsoft official applications are pre-registered in all tenants by default, so you don't need to do anything. But if you want to allow end users to use some other application, again, for example, for email access, the application needs to be registered as well for delegated access in the tenant. I have one example here. It's this application of Internet Accounts. This application called Apple Internet Accounts is the mail client on Apple devices. So if you want to use the Apple Mail client on your iPhone, iPad or Mac, this application needs to be registered for delegated access in Microsoft Entra ID. Otherwise, users will not be able to sign in to Apple Mail with their corporate identity. Let's take a look on what's configured here. The permissions. There are two types of permissions, or to be correct, two types of consent that you can give an application. The first one is admin consent. Admin consent means that admin has given consent to this application. The consequence is that all users in the tenant can use the application, and even new users in the future will be able to use this application because an admin has given consent to this application for all users. User consent is a consent that was given to the application by a specific user. So then the delegated permissions work, and this application then work only for the user that has given consent to the application. I don't see anything here. There are any users listed here because I have given admin consent to the application. But if you allow user consent, then users will be able to consent to an application and it will then be visible here. So all users that have given consent to the application will be here. If you do admin consent, then users don't need to consent to the application any longer, which is the reason why this list is empty. Here are the specific permissions that the application has. So we see that this application has 3 Microsoft Graph permissions. It's Open ID, claim, which is to allow sign-in of a user, offline access, which is to maintain access to data even when the user is offline, and Exchange Active Sync access to be technically able to access mailboxes via the Exchange Active Sync protocol. And you see all of these permissions are delegated permissions, which again means that the application itself doesn't have any permission. The application itself cannot do anything. This application can be used by end users who actively sign in to the application. And then via the delegated access, the application can act on behalf of the signed in user in this manner. So sign in, access emails via Exchange Active Sync protocol, and maintain access to data. If you want to disable access to the application, you can go to Properties and simply switch this to No. So enabled for users to sign in, No. That access would be blocked for your users. So even though the application would be still registered in your tenant, users will not be able to use the application any longer. And then you can potentially also delete the application from here, which completely removes the application from your tenant. And if someone needs to use the application again, consent would be required. So that's for delegated permissions, delegated access. Just to summarize it quickly, delegated permissions means that the application itself doesn't have any permissions. Just users are allowed to use the application to access some services integrated with Microsoft Entra ID. The application then acts on behalf of the user, or in other words, in the user's context, and the application only has the permissions that the user has. When user access expires, because the user is deleted, blocked, or password is changed, the access also is revoked. Alright, that was delegated permissions. Let's go back and open app registrations. App registrations are the applications that have application permissions. You see that I have 2 applications registered in my tenant with the application permissions. Let's open first Synology Active Backup for Microsoft 365. This application is used to backup my Microsoft 365 environment, the data from Microsoft 365 services. And this is a great example of application access, because this application doesn't act on behalf of any real user. This application acts on behalf of the tenant, and the permissions are assigned directly to the application because it's a service. It needs to run continuously. It doesn't run in any specific user context. If I go to certificates and secrets, you will see that there is a secret created for this application. Client certificate created for this application. This certificate is also used on my Synology that's used to back up the data. So this is the certificate that authenticates the Synology with this application, so that Synology, the device, can do the backup. The permissions that this application has is listed here. So you see quite a lot of permissions, but it's for the application or the service to be able to back up all data from all Microsoft 365 services. When you authenticate with an application that has application permissions, you can either use a certificate, as you can see here. So it's a certificate that's then also set on my Synology, and my Synology uses this certificate to authenticate with Microsoft Entra ID to actually prove that it is what it claims to be, and then it gives Synology access to the data so it can back up the data. But you can also use client secrets. Client secrets are similar to passwords. It's a randomly generated secret, a string, that you can then use in the service or application that needs to interact with Microsoft Entra ID with the application permissions that it's configured. And that's the case for Cloudflare Access. That's the other application that I've integrated here. So if I go to clients, certificates and secrets, you see one client secret generated here. So Cloudflare Access, in my example, uses a client secret. So it's a secret that was generated. I configure the secret on Cloudflare, and this application allows my users in my tenant to sign in to Cloudflare services or to my applications that are hidden behind Cloudflare Access. So it's a simple reverse proxy that provides access to some internal applications that are not published to the internet and provided only through the reverse proxy integrated with Cloudflare. I can check the permissions again, but this is much simpler because it just needs to read some user properties and allow users sign in. But that's it. It doesn't need to access any specific data. So this was the difference between application permissions and delegated permissions. To summarize it quickly, delegated permissions are permissions that are based on a real user. So if you give some application delegated permissions, it means that the users are able to sign in to the application, and the application then acts on behalf of the signed user. The authentication needs to be active. Whenever the authentication expires, the access also expires, because the application itself doesn't have any permissions. Always it's required for users to sign in with their credentials, and the application then acts in the user context. Application access gives applications access directly to Microsoft Entra ID, which means that the application itself has permissions to do something in the environment. There is no need for any user, any account to sign in, because the application itself has permanent permissions in the tenant. So those were the differences between application permissions and delegated permissions. I hope it's more clear now. You understand what's the difference and what to use in what situation or scenario. If you like the video, please share it. Share it on your social networks. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment or contact me directly. And that's all from my side for today. Thanks a lot for watching, and don't forget to follow my Cybersecurity World blog, where I regularly publish articles about some interesting topics in the world of IT and cybersecurity. Also, follow my social profiles on LinkedIn and Twitter, where I publish and also reshare some interesting posts of other users or provide my own tips and tricks. And I also publish a weekly newsletter from the world of IT and cybersecurity. You can find the newsletter on podcasts platforms such as Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. And that's really all from my side for today. Thanks a lot for watching and see you next time.